Welcome back, everybody, to our Bible study. Today we're in Leviticus chapter 23. Going to try to go through it in 5 minutes. Might be tough today because there's a lot going on here. But when did the events of Leviticus chapter 23 take place? Well, if you've been studying Leviticus with us, you'll know that Leviticus isn't so much about events that can be placed on a timeline, but the majority of the book is a set of instructions that God was giving to the Israelites to tell them how they needed to live and how they should act civilly and religiously in order to please him. So these instructions were probably given to Moses around 1490 BC. We've got some interesting terms to define in our definition section. The first one is a farming term. It is a sheaf. A sheaf is a bundle of grain stalks that has been tied together. Then the next two are units of measure. The first one, an ephah. An ephah is a unit of measure used for measuring grain, and it's about 22 liters of grain approximately. And then a hin, H-I-N. This is a unit of measure for liquids, and it's approximately 3.7 liters, or 0.98 gallons. Finally, the term convocation. Convocation is not a unit of measure. A convocation is a formal assembly of a large group of people. Jump over with me now to our outline on page number 2. And by the way, you can get this PDF for free on our website if you want it, and use it for your own personal study or to teach somebody else. This chapter is all about the special holy days that the Israelites were supposed to observe on an annual basis. And these are in addition to the special Sabbath day, which was supposed to be observed every seventh day of the week, where the Israelites weren't supposed to do any ordinary work. The first one that we're going to discuss, and that we've already discussed, you'll be familiar with it if you went through Exodus with us, is the Feast of Passover, or the observance of Passover, and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. This is verses 4 through 8. The Passover feast was supposed to be observed on the 14th day of the first month. The very next day, the 15th, was the beginning of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and that lasted for 7 days. Now, the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the 15th, and the last day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread were designated as a holy convocation. It was a special Sabbath day on which no work was supposed to be performed. Verses 9 through 14 talk about the celebration of first fruits. So this is another celebration. When the Israelites inherited the land of Canaan, you remember they're on their way there now, but they haven't gotten there. They're still in the wilderness. When they got there, they were to bring the first fruits of their harvest to the priests so that this sheaf of first fruits, could be offered to the Lord as a sacrifice. The sheaf was supposed to be offered on the day after the Sabbath day. And in addition to this sheaf, the same day, the Israelites were supposed to offer a male lamb as a burnt offering, a fifth of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil as a food offering, and a quarter of a hin of wine as a drink offering. So the grain from their new harvest wasn't supposed to be eaten until after they had offered this sacrifice. So God had blessed them with this great harvest, all this food, resources. They were supposed to offer the first of it in the form of a sheaf to him before they enjoyed it personally. Verses 15 through 22 describe the Feast of Weeks, which would later become known as Pentecost. The Israelites were supposed to count off 50 days from the time they offered the sheaf of the first fruits, and on the 50th day, that day was Pentecost, or the Feast of Weeks. On that day, a grain offering of 2 loaves of bread was to be brought to the priests, 7 lambs, 1 bull, and 2 rams were to be offered as a burnt offering. 1 male goat was offered as a sin offering, and 2 male lambs were offered as a peace offering. The day was also declared a day of holy convocation, and no ordinary work was supposed to be performed on that day. So you'll notice that as we use the term feast, it's not necessarily the way that we would define it as like a day where you get together and eat a ton of food with your friends. A feast day for the Israelites, although there probably were some celebrations connected with these, a feast day was really a special day to honor and to worship the Lord. The next special day was the Holy Convocation of the 7th month. This is sometimes called the Feast of Trumpets, verses 23 through 25. So on the first day of the 7th month, there was supposed to be a holy convocation and the people were supposed to rest. The day was marked by the playing of trumpets, which I suppose is where it gets the name Feast of Trumpets. All right, got all those. Now moving on to the next one, the Day of Atonement. This is verses 26 through 32. The 10th day of the 7th month was designated as the Day of Atonement, when the high priest went into the most holy place in the tabernacle and offered sacrifices for his own sins and for the sins of the people. The specific sacrifices that were supposed to be offered on that day, you can read about in detail in Leviticus chapter 16, and we have a PDF and a video for that chapter as well if you're interested. The day was, again, another day of holy convocation, and no ordinary work was supposed to be done. One thing that was unique about this day is that the children of Israel were supposed to afflict themselves. Afflict is the term that the English Standard Version uses. Most commentators interpret that as they were supposed to fast this day and not eat. And then finally, verses 33 through 44, the Feast of Booths, sometimes called the Feast of Tabernacles. On the 15th day of the 7th month, so this would have been 5 days after the Day of Atonement, the Israelites were supposed to observe the Feast of Booths for 7 days. The first day was a holy convocation, and each day the people were supposed to bring food offerings and to, quote, rejoice before the Lord. They were supposed to do that with, quote, the fruit of the splendid trees, branches of palm trees, and boughs of leafy trees and willows, according to verse 40. On the 8th day, another food offering was to be brought, and the people were to once again abstain from work. One thing that was unique about the Feast of Booths is that during the 7 days of the feast, the people were supposed to live in booths, in basically like temporary structures. A booth was a temporary structure that probably had leaves and foliage and tree branches as its covering to guard against the elements. You might ask, well, why were they supposed to do this? What's the point? This was to remind the people of how God had led them out of Egypt and how they had been sojourners in the wilderness, living in these temporary structures as God guided them to the Canaan land. All right, so that's all we've got for Leviticus chapter 23. And what I wanted to do with the application section is to try to clarify that information and outline it as concisely as I possibly could so that it's not all just like jumbled in your brain, all those dates, all those details. So that's what I've tried to do here. So just in order, as far as I know, this is correct. The first month on the 14th day, that was Passover. The first month on the 15th day, and lasting for 7 days after, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The first month, the 16th day, was the celebration of first fruits where people brought their sheaf to be offered to the Lord, the first of their harvest. Now, I will say, this date is debated. We don't know if it was the 16th for sure. The Bible doesn't tell us that it was the 16th day of the month. It says that first fruits were supposed to be offered the day after the Sabbath. And there's debate as to which Sabbath day that's actually referring to. Is it referring to, the typical Sabbath that happens every week on the 7th day of the week? Or is it referring to one of the holy convocations, which were special Sabbath days, which were supposed to happen the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the last day of Unleavened Bread, right? So there's interesting arguments going both ways, but just know the first fruits were supposed to be offered the day after Sabbath, after one of those Sabbaths that took place during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And that is interesting because it relates to like the day that Jesus died and when exactly that was. Traditionally, he died on Good Friday, right? But there's an interesting argument to be made that he actually died on Thursday, and okay, I'm not going to get into that. We don't have time. We're probably over time already. So anyway, just know there's some debate about that one. 50 days after first fruits were offered, that was supposed to be the day of Pentecost, or the Feast of Weeks. Now, in the 7th month, the first day of the month, that was the Holy Convocation, sometimes called the Feast of Trumpets. The 7th month, the 10th day of the month, that was the Day of Atonement. 5 days later, the 7th day, the 15th day of the month, and lasting for 8 days after that, we have the Feast of Booths and a special day of Holy Convocation at the conclusion of the Feast of Booths, sometimes called the Feast of Tabernacles. All right, so that is Leviticus chapter 23. Hopefully I made that a little bit clearer and didn't just confuse you further. And Lord willing, I'll see you again tomorrow for Leviticus chapter 24.